All right, everybody. Welcome to this live stream on Lebanon. I'm hoping that it will work. Last time that I actually did a live stream, I was in Beirut and I struggled for 15 or 20 minutes, had a bunch of you help me with tech support, and then I ended up doing it on my phone. So, my hope is that you all can hear me. So, I'll wait to make sure if you could tell me in the chat that you can hear me, and then I'll get started. So, it sounds like my audio is working. I tested it somewhere else just now. So, we'll get started. Um, if you'll look in the description for the stream, you'll see that I put a link to this map of Lebanon, which is from the two. It was from a newspaper article about the 2022 election. And if you want to pull it up on a screen, it will be helpful to I don't know, think about different ways that you can understand what's going on in Lebanon. And if you look at the map, you can say to yourself, wow, that's a lot of different religions, a lot of different peoples, and they're all in this country together. And so Lebanon defies easy explanations, it defies black and white answers, it defies simplicity. And I've had an Israeli friend tell me that if you put two Jews into a room, you're going to have at least three opinions. And I feel that way about Lebanese as well. That if you put two Lebanese people together, you're going to have at least three opinions, maybe four opinions. And I remember being in Lebanon and hearing some of the conversations, and one of the phrases was "politics never ends." It's a discussion that always keeps going on, and part of it is the complication of this country. So because I'm telling you that it defies simplicity, the way I'm going to run the stream today is I'm just going to try to talk about different concepts of Lebanon and different things that you need to know and understand and things that I'm still learning. So as I say, the title is this A Beginner's Guide to Lebanon from a Beginner. So what I'm reporting on is what I've read, what I've studied, learned, and then what I experienced when I was in Lebanon earlier this summer. And obviously we can't talk about Lebanon outside of the recently state-sponsored terrorist attack on innocent civilians that were nearby. And I think there was a meme that said, state that has the ability to target individuals has been carpet bombing a population for 11 months. And so it tells you everything that you need to know about the way that Israel conducts operations. But so what I'll try to do is I'll read a little bit. I'll be monitoring the comment section. I'm also running an X space as an experiment. I don't know how it will work. I don't know if it will work very well, and I'll monitor the comment section. And if there's an opportunity to stop, I'll try to talk about it. If you have a question about something that I will talk about later, I'll push you towards that later portion of the stream, and then we can see how it goes from there. Okay. So I think the first idea is that of Lebanon developing on its own. That we've talked about in different streams and different videos. The idea that religion develops a culture, and a culture develops politics. And that's why politics is different in other parts of the world. Some countries prefer a monarchy or a strong, let's say, central leader, and other places, let's say like Switzerland, Switzerland has had a democracy for centuries. So it flows from your culture, which flows from your religion. Now, you can look at religion tied to ethnicity. An ethnic group develops in that same way. It's rare, almost unheard of in world history for there to be an ethnicity to develop absent a religion, with absolutely no reference to religion whatsoever. So, with that in mind, if we're talking about ethnicities helping to form peoples, which then over time turn into nations, and then very recently, very, very recently, we have modern nation states. We did not have modern nation states for most of human existence. So, sometimes those peoples and those nations are overlaid onto modern nation states. So, as we look at the map of Lebanon, we have to understand, how do you tie this together as one nation? So here are some quotes. One is from Kamal Jumblat, who's a famous Druze leader in Lebanon. There is no such thing as a Lebanese community. There is no Lebanese social unit. Lebanon is a collection of sects and socio-religious communities. This is not a society, not a community, not a nation. And so if if you think about that, here's a Druze citizen of Lebanon saying there's no such thing as a Lebanese community, and this was something that I put to the Lebanese when I was in Lebanon, asking them, well, what does it mean to be Lebanese? And we jokingly said, because I observed this a lot, there's this great joy among the Lebanese, despite the tragedies that surrounds them, despite the tragedy that has touched many individuals in many different ways. There is a joy in the Lebanese people. And we talked about clapping of hands. And one of my drivers, as we were driving up to Bishare, was talking about this hand clapping. And we drove past a bus. It was 9 in the morning on a Sunday. And we saw people in the back of the bus clapping. And then when I was with someone else in Batroun, we were walking around the town, and we saw a little cart, and there were people clapping in the cart. So joking aside, yes, I think the Lebanese are joyful people who, clap their hands, to show that joyfulness. The question is, well, what does it mean to be Lebanese? What is it that you are um, developing? Okay. And here's another quote. This is from Sandra Mackey. I put a link to the Goodreads review of her book, which I read, Lebanon, A House Divided. She wrote that in 1989. Now, obviously, 1989, that's a long time ago, especially in the history of Lebanon, but she does an exceptionally good job of tying together the major themes to help you understand SIT's big picture ideas. And I would encourage you to read that book. And she says, over thousands of years, the Lebanese developed a culture that perhaps only they can truly understand. A culture in which the trunk is Arab and the branches pure Lebanese. Um, Also, something to understand about the Lebanese is their entrepreneurial spirit. There's a proverb: he can make a wine cellar out of one grape. Um, but there's also a vengefulness. Kiss the hand you cannot bite, and pray to God to break it. So you have this great love, you have this great um, vengefulness, you have this great entrepreneurial spirit. I'm describing elements of Lebanese culture, but remember, I'm not describing a particular ethnicity or even a particular religion, because as you look at the map, there's a lot of different religions, and those are tied to different ethnicities. Something else that's particularly important for Westerners to understand is Arab culture and its difference from Western culture. So there's a concept of AHL, kin, which extends in a much deeper way. And this may be the case, let's say, if you go out into the countryside of many Western countries, you may still see this kind of bonding in which, let's say, a first cousin in your family is like a brother, and a third cousin is considered part of, let's say, like what a first cousin is. So there is a great concept of hospitality that the stories that the Lebanese would tell me about how they would help people, I was so impressed. And um, yeah, the word is impressed, not because Westerners are not capable of great kindness. They certainly are. But I think that kindness tends to be expressed when we see something right in front of us. So if we see an old lady struggling to get across the street, everyone will pull over, or many people pull over and then try to help that old lady across the street. Or if we see someone getting attacked, we will run to their rescue. But Lebanese, and let's say Arabs in general, will have this attitude of just helping a total stranger, someone that they've never seen in their life, someone they don't know anything about. They see someone in distress, they will help them. Part of that is tied to, if they're Muslim, the Ummah, this larger idea of who they are as a people. But part of it is just traditional Arab hospitality. And you have to remember, Arabs have been around for a long time. And this tradition of hospitality is particularly important, let's say, in the desert, which obviously not all Arabs live only in deserts, but that idea of hospitality is particularly important in the desert, which can be a dangerous place. So that was something else that you have to understand, is that you'll understand more about Lebanon is they keep taking in refugees, not because they have so much money or they would love to take in refugees, but because that's what happens. So the idea is, you have the Armenians who are being ethnically cleansed by the Turks. They have to come down in the 1920s. We have the Palestinians being ethnically cleansed by the Israelis. They come in the 1940s. So The Lebanese extended hospitality, even though this made life difficult for them, even though they didn't have the money to do it. And that's the sort of hospitality that you'll see in Arab countries, is hospitality that extends itself even when they can't financially afford it, because they feel um, obliged or a duty to do that. A question in the chat: who named the country Lebanon? Okay, well, there's different answer. I've read different answers for this, but one is the idea of a Phoenician word, ibn, which means white, and relation to the snow-capped peaks. Lebanon is a very mountainous country, and so the snow-capped peaks of Lebanon, that's the relation. This is a beginner's guide, so I'm happy to be corrected by my Lebanese friends who I invited to join the chat and correct me. I expect frequent corrections. So this idea of a tribal or large-scale hospitality also relates to the idea of government. Loyalty is to people, not to institutions. Loyalty is to a sheikh, or is to a head of a family, or the head of a village, or to a particular person, like the person I quoted, Kamal Jumblat, not to an institution. And so when Arafat and other people were making deals or trying to do negotiations, they thought they were dealing with a person. But in the West, we deal with people in office. And when they leave office, they don't have the same power that they did. So when they think they're making a deal with a person and that person speaks for that country indefinitely, that's how it can work in the Arab world. And that's how it works in many other parts of the world. But it doesn't work that way in Western so-called liberal democracies. So if you make a deal with one person and then that person goes out of office and the next person comes in and totally disagrees with that deal, then you're out. So if you have an Arab culture that has loyalty to to people rather than to institutions, then you can fail to say love and defend the institutions that are governing your country. And we see this over and over in particularly the Lebanese civil war that started in 1975, but even to the present day, there's a challenge of how do I relate loyalty to the headmen or the charismatic individuals in my community versus loyalty to institutions. Let's see in the quotes. Lebanese chauvinism claims Phoenician heritage, denies Arab identity, quite a bit of sectarian. Let's see if I can put can I put this up here? Yeah. Lebanese chauvinism claims Phoenician heritage, denies Arab identity, quite a bit of sectarian antagonism, without violence until recent meddling by the US and Israel. We'll talk about that. Arab Palestinians was hospitable to Jewish refugees who then turned against them and stole their lands. We know about this, and we will talk about the Palestinians soon. There's a joke that I was told, which I found very funny, that there's a lifelong Muslim. He's on his deathbed, and he asks his family to call for a Maronite priest. And the family is very scandalized. How can you do this? Uncle, grandfather, father, however it might be. And he leans in close and he says, better for one of them to die than us. So the idea is, I'm going to convert to a Maronite, die as a Maronite, and that way, we won't die. But just, again, those dynamics of race, religion, ethnicity within Lebanon, very, very, very clear. So let's talk about some broad stroke history. 5000 BC, we have Phoenicians in this area, and they were in other parts of the Mediterranean as well. They were very well known as traders, and Maronites who identify as Phoenicians would say that that's part of their entrepreneurial spirit, is that they're from the Phoenicians. I'll address that later. Obviously, then you have the Romans, the Byzantines, the caliphates. I think there were 3 caliphates. Then you have a crusader state, and then you have a couple more caliphates. And then obviously the Ottomans, and then the French mandate for Syria and the Lebanon. And the fundamental issue that I think is at play when you think about Lebanon as a country, as a nation state, is Lebanon part of the East or part of the West? Can Arabs have anything to do with the West? Can Islam have anything to do with the West? There are clearly different answers to this. You have Muslims living in the West. You have Arabs who want to have something to do with the West. You have Arabs who don't want anything to do with the West. So there's clearly not an answer. But the problem is these questions are being fought out on the lands of Lebanon, and the people are having to pay the price for it. It's shocking when you consider the violence in Lebanon's history across time. And if I think about it in relation to this map, right, as we've talked about, that red is the Maronite. Now, you might ask yourself, well, aren't Maronites Catholics? Why is there Catholic? Yes, that's true. Maronites are Catholics, but for purpose of this, Maronite Catholics consider themselves different, not just, let's say, as a religious domination. They do have a different liturgy, but also, let's say, as an ethnicity. Being Maronite is so important that it was tied to the presidency of Lebanon. In order to be the president of Lebanon, you have to be a Maronite Christian. So all of these distinctions. So, for example, Catholic here on this map refers to Greek Catholics or Melkite Catholics, who tend to, let's say, culturally side more with the Greek Orthodox, even though they pledge obedience to Rome. Then you have the Armenian Catholics, which the Armenians are sort of a nation in exile, set aside. They take their own side, you could say. And other Christians could be other Orthodox, or maybe even some Protestants, but I would suspect that's a very small amount. And of course, the Druze, who are their own religion. And so, if you think about, sorry, I got a bit lost there talking about different Catholic divisions. So if I think about who is battling who at different times, you've had the Maronites, who at times have been supported by the Israelis and the Sunnis, who are very happy to share power with the Maronites for some time until it became politically untenable for them in a sort of pan Islamic move. And then you have the Shia, who were at other times supported by other Muslim groups and now represent, let's say, the fastest growing demographic in Lebanon. So let's start with that. Maybe that might be unfamiliar to some of my Western viewers. What is the difference between Sunni Muslim and Shia Muslim? I always laugh when I talk to Americans about this, because despite the fact that America has invaded numerous Arab countries and occupied them for decades, most Americans on the street, despite having potentially lost family members in those wars or paid for those wars or have become indebted because of those wars, they don't know the difference between a Sunni Muslim and a Shia Muslim. It's not that complicated, to be fair, but the fact that we don't even have the curiosity to ask these questions, I think, is disturbing and revelatory. So, if we think about it just in terms of governance, a Sunni Muslim believes that the caliph, the leader of Islam, you could say, could be elected by one of Muhammad's lieutenants. And the Shia's argument was it should come from Muhammad's family. Now, in the early stages of Islam, the first position, the Sunni position, prevailed because I think the first three caliphs after Muhammad were from his lieutenants. Ali finally gets himself, I think, made the caliph, I think the fourth caliph, but he's murdered soon after. And Hussein, his son, I think, goes into battle. Karbala. He goes into battle there, slaughtered, and their bodies are treated very poorly. And this resonates in Shia consciousness that there's a great deal of emotion tied to this martyrdom. And for the Sunnis, you could say it's about legalism, emotional detachment, and sometimes they refer to Shia as those people, if you think about it that way. The Shia were at one point a quarter of the population, and you can see here certainly more in the 2022 map, 30% of the population, rapidly growing. Often they would work the fields. They were an underclass. So despite having such a large population, they were not very well represented within Lebanon, and particularly, let's say, in the funding, the money that would go out to different municipalities, despite being something like at the time 20% of the population, 25% of the population, they would only get something like 2 or 5% of the finances. So this was a long simmering discontent among the Shia for many years. Now, how were the Shia developed? They were developed by an Iranian cleric named Musa al-Sadr. Now, al-Sadr took this martyr focused emotional expression of Islam in Shia and transformed it into something quite revolutionary. And interestingly enough, he ended up disappearing himself in 1978. He vanished and enters the sort of lore of the vanished imam. This is something that is within the Shia religion, that that final imam will come back towards the end of the world, and he is this vanished imam. Now, the path that was being led by Al Sadr then gets divided. So if he disappears, who is going to fill that space? And you have Amal and Hezbollah. So Amal, which is okay with the secular state of Lebanon, and Hezbollah, who looks to the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollah Khomeini as ideas, as inspirations. So we could make Lebanon like Iran. That's one group of people. And you have Amal at the time, who don't agree with this idea and are arguing for a secular state. So even though they're both Shia, even though they say they come from this line of Musa al-Sadr, who had developed the Shia in Lebanon, they don't agree. So I hope that you can start to see, even within religious communities, even within ethnicities, you can have fracturing about how to govern yourself. And this goes back to my point that I made originally, that if you are a single ethnicity living in your country, your culture and your politics flow from that. So you understand, you have the same shared values about how to live the good life and how to make express that as a country. If you don't share that, you basically have to make agreements and laws to come to a way that you can live together. But that becomes much more complicated. It relies on diplomacy, it relies on good leaders, and it can fracture in a moment if those agreements are not well put together. So talking about the Sunni, the Shia, obviously, I don't want to ignore the fact that there are Sufi Muslims as well. They don't play as big of a role in Lebanon, but that's 20%, you could say, of the Sunni uh, uh, portion of Islam. So if we think about Islam as a whole, let's say 90% of the worldwide population of Islam is Sunni and 10% is Shia. I'm happy to be corrected in the chat if it's 85-15. I'm not trying to say who's better or who's not. I'm just trying to explain to Westerners who don't understand how Islam is divided where those are. Now, we still have a couple more groups to talk about. Just stay patient with me here. There's a lot to cover. We have the Alawites. Now, the Alawites are an ethno-religious group similar to the Druze, in which my ethnicity and my religion are tied together. Now, some people would say that that is how Arabs and Islam are related, but this doesn't make any sense because Arabs existed and had religions before Islam, and there are plenty of Arabs that are not Muslims. So that's not the same relationship. Whereas Alawites, there are no Alawites who don't practice the Alawite religion. There are no Druze that are not related to the Druze religion. It's just tied together. Now, there's differences here, right? So the Alawites, they would say that they're only tangentially related. And if you talk to an Alawite cleric, he would say that we are doctrinally not related to the Shia. And they drink alcohol. They believe in reincarnation, I think. And I think they saw Ali as an incarnation of God, right? So that's the Alawites. That's helpful to understand because that's a ruling minority in Syria. The Druze do not identify as Muslims, even though there may be a link in development there. 90% of, so if you think about the Druze, 90% of Druze and all the Druze women are outsiders, you could say, and only 10% of Druze are, you could say, practitioners of the religion. They know the religion, they know the ceremonies, they practice the ceremonies. It's very secret. And the rest are basically just supporters. They're just everyday Druze. You could say they intellectually adhere to religion, but they don't participate in it, if that makes any sense. And I think the term is Uqal, Uqqal in English lettering. Those are the insiders, and the Juhal are everyone else within the Druze. I think the Druze also have a sense of reincarnation similar to the Alawites. So for the Druze, what's really important to understand, and we'll see this both in the Druze in Israel as well as the Druze in Lebanon is religion is not so important as ethnic and group cohesion. So, what defines them is that we together are going to make a decision. We're going to live here. We're going to die here. There's a quote from the book that I referenced in the description in which the person says, "We're going to live or die here, but we're not leaving." That's how it is. And there is a deep, deep attachment to the land in the Druze that I've rarely seen in ethnicities around the world. So, rain or shine, you like the Druze, don't like the Druze, they clearly have a deep attachment to the land. And you have to realize that idea of reincarnation, the Alawites and the Druze are not so geographically removed from the home of Hinduism and Buddhism, for which reincarnation is a part of the belief system. Let me take a moment to look at the chat. Let's see. By implementing the Holy Book of Quran and worship the Almighty Allah in His houses, mosques, and memorize from charities. Are you referring to? You might be referring to Muslims in general. I think Sufi is just a term to describe a person who contemplates a lot and looks towards the philosophical side of the religion. But it's not an ism. It's not a separate religion or sect, and that's fair enough. I remember meeting a Sufi in France not that many years ago, and we talked about it a little bit, and she related it in the same way that it's philosophy, and again, you could say a more emotional a look at things as opposed to a more legalistic look at things. And again, I'm not Muslim, so I'm not commenting on who's right or wrong. I'm just trying to help people understand the background we're talking about here. So when you're talking about the Sunni and the Shia, you're talking about two people that are in a religion together, but do not consider themselves necessarily part of the same religion. Similar to how Greek Orthodox and Catholics might consider themselves both Christians, but they have differences. So I've talked about the Maronites. If you don't understand the Maronites, and like you're not going to understand Lebanon, they're an integral part of this story, this battle, this fight, however you want to look at it. And they very much identify as Phoenicians. And when I say they, I'm not saying every single Maronite ever. I'm talking about this sort of larger position of Maronites is we are not Arabs. Arabs are the people who are going to kill us, and we are trying to prevent ourselves from being killed by the Arabs. We are not Arabs. That's the position, okay? And that's the idea of, well, we're Phoenicians. And the Maronites have an affinity with the West, which dates back to the Crusades, specifically the French. As we know, there were French who came on crusade and were part of creating the Crusader states. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Lebanon for the Maronites is the eastern part of Christianity. And for non-Maronites, let's say for Muslims, this is the western part of Islam. So there's going to be a battle about that. And the Maronite collective memory is enforced by a battle that they had with the Druze in 1860 specifically. I think the conflict had started prior to 1860, but there is a very brutal massacre of 12,000 Maronites, men, women, and children, that happened over a 6-hour period. They were just brought into a town square and they were just getting murdered for 6 hours. Now, I'm not saying that Maronites did not commit any violence against the Druze. As I say, I'm simply trying to paint a picture here. So this is a scar in their mind, not because the Druze are Muslims, because remember I said Druze are not Muslims, they have their own religion, but Druze are Arabs, and Arabs came and killed us. And if we don't get protection from the West, Arabs will wipe us out. And so there is a fear that dominates Maronite thinking. There's also entrepreneurialism that dominates Maronite thinking. There's lots of different things, but fear is part of it. The way they think about the political situation is if we don't hold on to some kind of power, we're going to get wiped out by the Arabs. The Arabs, okay? Now, interestingly, within the Christian sects, you have Greek Orthodox. The Greek Orthodox are, you could say, more related to the Arabs because they lived with the Arabs under the Ottomans for centuries. So they know how to live with the Arabs. They lived successfully with the Arabs. Now, there's sort of sub questions there that I don't want to get bogged down into how the Greek patriarchate in this part of the world is governed. And yeah, that's a different conversation. We'll get into that. But you would say that the Greek Orthodox or more related to the Arabs. They have an affinity to Syria. They're comfortable with pan-Arabism. They can live with anyone. So, how do the Palestinians relate to this? Palestinians are majority Sunni Islam, Sunni Muslims. So, of that large majority of Palestinians, I would say 1.5, 2% are Christians, and you can divide that 1.5, 2% roughly into Orthodox and Melkite or Roman Catholic. Now, what about the Palestinians in Lebanon? Well, as we all know, they were ethnically cleansed out of Israel in 1948, and they are classified as non-nationals. And I think until 1995, they were not allowed to hold 70 different jobs. Obviously, the Lebanese already have their own problems. They have their own financial struggles. Having a huge flood of immigrant labor was politically untenable, and that's why that law passed that Palestinians couldn't work. And I think that's been reformed. I think maybe it's down to 20 jobs that they can't have in Lebanon. But they're very much apart from the population. When I visited Shatila earlier this year or a couple months ago, there are red and white blocks that block off the camp, almost as a sign like, by the way, you're going to go into a Palestinian refugee camp. Like, we're not going to protect you here. And they live in a lot of poverty. Some have to resort to crime to survive. I was scolded by a couple of my Lebanese friends for going to Shatila without a local escort. That's a conversation for another time. But one was willing to confess to me that said, Stephen, he says, as horrible as the Shatila massacres are, and he says, I'm not justifying them. If Shatila had not happened, perhaps the forces that supported Lebanon would have overtaken the government in Lebanon, and things could have gotten even worse. And someone from Amal, in relation to the Palestinians, said the people of the south of Lebanon, have given the Palestinian cause their land, their children, their security, their orchards, everything but their honor and dignity, a villager said. We gave the Palestinians everything, and they gave us back insults, corpses, and a lesson in corruption. And so what does that mean? That means the people in the south of Lebanon were happy to have the Israelis come in 1982 because they thought, well, anything's better than how we're being treated by the PLO. And then what happens? The Israelis show who they are, and which took them about 3 seconds. They massacre and kill a bunch of people, bomb houses, kill civilians, kill children. And the people in the south realize, well, we don't like the Palestinians, but the Israelis for us are potentially the greater enemy. All right, let's see what the comments are saying. Most of the Islamic Sufi scholars were busy just studying the philosophy, and as they were living in an Islamic society, they did not need to get so involved as much in the politics. Sufism is the esoteric arm of Islam. What I used to call mosque Muslims often look down on Sufis. So now it's going to get complicated. Shia are a construct to destroy Islam from within, just like they did to true Christianity. There are 450,000 happy Jews living in Iran today. This is something that the mainstream media is not going to talk about, right? If Iran is the greatest enemy to Israel, what are all those Jews doing living in Israel? Being a Jewish person is not the problem. The problem is the Zionist who has entered the world since the 1900s. We have all read Herzl's books and know the ideas he has instigated. Yeah, okay, but you have to keep in mind, there are plenty of Jews who've not read Herzl's book. And to say that it's all about Herzl and that we have to distinguish between Zionists and Jews, I think ignores the fact that you don't have to be a Zionist to be a supporter of Zionism. There's a lot of sleepwalking Jews in Israel who are they're fine with the status quo, forever war against the Palestinians. They're out to kill us. They believe the narrative. So they may not be out there fighting on the front lines. They may not be settlers, but you don't have to be a Zionist. You don't have to be a settler to be part of the problem. So I want to make that really clear. People who want to say, oh, it's the Zionists that are a problem, the Jews have nothing to do with it. You're talking about there nothing being wrong with the Jewish religion. If someone wants to be, I think you're saying if someone wants to be a Jew, that's fine. I wouldn't make that argument. But the idea is we have to be really clear on Zionists versus Jews. And I really don't think that that's so important. I think that there are plenty of Jews who are complicit in Zionist actions because they don't act against them. Howdy, Stephen. Are you studying to get your PhD? No, I am not. I've had enough school. I have an undergraduate degree and I have a master's. I am finished with school. Shias' beliefs are like Christians' belief in Hussein for God. They have multiple sects. Yes. Didymus, Jews were a problem long before Zionism. Look at Hellenistic Egypt and Cyprus. Yes. All right. So continuing on. So hopefully, as I say, lots of broad strokes. Trying to help you and trying to help myself understand this. This map gets us to 1943, which is the National Pact. The National Pact is unwritten. For Westerners who are used to written constitutions, obviously there's no written constitution in England, but they still refer to the English Constitution. This is another example of this, something that's unwritten, but it's understood by the politicos in Lebanon. So the National Pact mandates that the president has to be a Maronite Christian, that the prime minister has to be Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament has to be Shia, and the deputy speaker of the parliament has to be Greek Orthodox. So this was based on the 1932 census. The 1932 census gave Christians a 51% majority. Very, very narrow, right? 51% majority. And what that allowed them to do is create, I think, a 6-to-5 count. So for every 6 Christians in a government position or in the military, there'd be 5 Muslims. And what was the reaction to the National Pact? This is from Nabi Berry. We behaved like tribes instead of like people of one country. The 1943 pact that we created is a partitionist pact. It helped us build a farm, not a country. And it dealt with the insecurities of the Maronites. The Maronites thought, well, as long as we have the presidency, we can look out for our interests. We'll make sure our people don't get slaughtered. We'll make sure that we continue to have ascendancy in the country. It was shared with me that of the bank deposits in Lebanon, 30% of the bank deposits in Lebanon are controlled by Maronites. So they're obviously elite when it comes to finances as well. So they're trying to protect their interests, and that's part of how they think about things. So there is a mandate. We talked about it way back in the beginning of the stream. The mandate for Syria and the Lebanon is run by the French. 1943, things start to break down a little bit because the French are in a war, and there's also an occupational part of France and a free French force. And I think they actually clash in Lebanon for the first time. But in any case, by 1946, the French leave, and you have to realize that there are Muslims who see even the French mandate, which was not, you could say, a Christian mandate, but as one supportive of the Christians, as a new crusader state. And this is a sort of larger question about the Crusades. And we don't have time to talk about it in this stream today, but you have to realize the Crusades were a defensive war, not an offensive war. For Christians who were traveling to the Holy Land, there was a lot of harassment that they faced on the way to visit the holy sites. And so the move to, let's say, make that way safer for them was to recapture what was originally Christian lands before Islam came about. So Lebanon and this area, they were Christian for centuries before Islam conquered a lot of that land. And in fact, that's how the Maronites get to Lebanon, is I think they were from further south in the Levant, and they fled up the coast to flee the conquest that was coming up that way. So if we think about crusader state as, in the mind of Islam, the West trying to invade us and convert us all, rather than looking at the Crusades for what they were, which was a defensive war to restore what was originally Christian land. The conflict there theologically with Islam is that a land that was once Muslim can never go back to the Christians. There is the Dar al-Harb and there's the Dar al-Islam, and you cannot give the land back to the Christians. So there's no concept of living in peace with Christians if the land was Muslim at one point. So for them, they had to take that back. The French mandate was a new incarnation of the Crusader state and inflamed the Muslim mind. And then later on, even to the present day, the idea of the Crusaders are not necessarily religious Catholics. It's a question of the West. And that goes back to what I say is the fundamental question of what's going on in Lebanon is it going to be the most western part, the easternmost part of Europe, or the westernmost part of Islam? And the idea that it could be both, it's an idealistic, can't we all get along, Rodney King idea of things, that is clearly not going to work for this blood-soaked part of the world. So 1946, the French withdraw, and we've talked about the idea of history being continuous. Um, Amira Haas talks about this in Drinking the Sea at Gaza, is that for the Palestinians, there's never any time to pause, reflect, think about what's happened, rest, sleep, eat. Everything just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming and coming, right? So the same thing has happened to the Palestinians, right? So in 1946, the French withdraw. In 1947, you get the first influx of Palestinian refugees because remember, prior to May 15th, 1948, you have the Israeli forces attacking, killing, murdering, expelling Palestinians, and they start leaving. And they had already come to Lebanon in the past. So during the Arab Revolt, 1936 to 39, there were families who fled to Lebanon. Some of them came back, some of them stayed in Lebanon. So they had relatives, okay, we'll go, we're dealing with war here. We'll go up to Lebanon. We'll stay with our family or our family members. And so now this country that's just brand new, the French have left. They have this national pact, which is trying to do power sharing with the ethnicities and the religions. They now have the Palestinians show up. Palestinians who are a people who've had their land taken from them and don't have any friends and are not allowed to work in the country, and the Lebanese are not going to expel them. They're there, and so the PLO begins to use these, I would argue, quite self-entitledly as an operation for attacks into Israel. Now, I am not arguing that the Palestinians don't have a right to defend themselves or to take back the country that was taken from them. But you also have to realize you're on someone else's country. And if you really believe in the importance of the sovereignty of your own country, you have to give as much allowance as possible to the people of the country in which you are a guest. And I think there was so much anger and rage in the Palestinians at that time, totally understandable, that they didn't really take into account the feelings of the Lebanese in the South, and they built up resentment, which then ended up coming out in the 1980s. So that happens. We have then elections in 1957, which leads to a war. The Lebanese do not refer to this as a war; they call it the events in 1958. And again, that East versus West clash. I think at one point the national forces capture the radio station and they start playing Arabic music, and then the Western coalition comes in and they destroy all the Arabic records and they start playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So it's easy for me to laugh, right? I didn't deal with the violence. I didn't deal with the heartbreak. I didn't deal with my country being torn apart. It's easy for me to laugh when I relate that story. I'm not laughing about it. I'm not trying to say that this wasn't a terrible thing, but you can see in just little things like that, little actions like that, what was at stake, what was sort of a larger part of the narrative for these people. Obviously, the PLO being headquartered in southern Lebanon and attacking Israel, Israel at some point is going to react to this, and they raid the airport in Beirut. They destroy planes, and this obviously continues with escalations. And at some point, how are things developing? The Lebanese are a very resilient people. They are the, let's say, Arab version of keep calm and carry on. The English very much pride themselves on the fact, bombs are being dropped and they're still going about doing things. The day that I was leaving Lebanon this summer, the Israelis had just, as usual, threatened to attack because they're the best neighbors in the world. And my flight had been canceled by Aegean. So I had spent 2.5 hours the night before and quite a bit of money to find an alternative way out of Beirut Um, Aegean had canceled their flights for the next 6 days. Lufthansa, a number of people had canceled it. So I was trying to get out of Lebanon, and I had managed to find a way. And that morning, then at the check-in desk, the lady's like, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a bit nervous. Like, this is my first time dealing with something like this." And she looked at the security guard to her left, and they both smiled. And classic, like, first time look at me. And so I laughed with them too. That they and at one point the power went out in the airport, and the Lebanese just sort of shrugged it off, like, this is Tuesday, it's no big deal. And they're just a resilient people. They're not happy about the situation, but they're not going to cry about it. They're certainly not going to come complain about it to you. If you talk to them, they may open up and they may share some of that hurt and pain with you, but they're never going to come to you and complain about it. No way. So 1976, Syria enters the chat. Okay. And before I do that, maybe I will look at the chat here. The Talmudists led the grounds to corrupt every religion under the sun, but the Holy Quran, because Allah said he is protecting the Quran. I hope Stephen changes his mind and gets his PhD. I'm not going to do that, but I appreciate the idea. Listen, I can just learn all those people you mentioned: Noam Chomsky, Avi Schleim, Ilan Pape, Edward Said, Rashid Khalidi, Norm Finkelstein, people I admire greatly on the Palestinian issue and who I've come to learn so much from. I'm just hoping to learn from them. There's no way. I mean, think of someone like Edward Said, someone who was actually born in Palestine, and what he's able to bring to the conversation. All I can do, hopefully, is to try to explain some of this to other people. PhD isn't necessary anymore. Yeah, that's true. I agree with that. I don't think these leaders of countries follow any religion. If they did, they wouldn't make bombs and sell bombs to kill other human beings indiscriminately. Religion is just used as a scapegoat. I think, yes, to some extent that's true. I think, look deeper. How can you be the head of a country if you don't have any children? You literally have no skin in the game. So you have people like Macron and all these other horrible people who didn't have any children, and you think, how am I supposed to take you seriously? And by the way, Macron giving we're standing with the Lebanese people, blah blah blah, typical boring speech. Does he name who the attacker was? Does he say we will stand against the attacker of the Lebanese people? No. Macron, as usual, loves to get a photo op, doesn't actually do anything. He's been useless. The French people know he's useless. However many more years until he's gone. So, what else do we have in the chat? The USA and UK could have stopped sending arms to Israel months ago, but that's not allowed. That would make them anti-Semitic. You can't stop sending arms to the Israelis and the Palestinians. And some compliments for me. Thank you very much in the chat. Some very kind words. So, 1976, Syria enters the chat. Now, you have to think about this historically. If we think about the Ottoman Empire, Damascus and Beirut, you could say, were part of the axis that ruled what is now historically Palestine, what we know as Palestine. So we look at these three different countries, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine now, and we think about them being different. And there are differences. But historically, it was one sort of large thing. And Greater Syria was in the mind and concern of other forces in the area. It's like, well, we don't want there to be a Greater Syria. But Syria considers Lebanon historically and geographically as part of its sphere of influence, in the way that America considers the Caribbean part of its sphere of influence, such that they almost went to war with Russia over Russia putting missiles in Cuba and forced the Russians to take their missiles out. But as typical for America, hypocritically puts all of their missiles right on Russia's border. And there's memes going around. You can find them on the internet. Look at how close Russia put their country to our missiles. So what's the sphere of influence? China considers the South China Sea their sphere of influence. That's understandable. A large country, it's the body of water. America considers it our sphere of influence, despite the fact that we don't live anywhere near the South China Sea. Do you see a pattern developing here? And so Syria considers Lebanon historically and geographically part of its sphere of influence. So they want to influence what is going on there. They don't necessarily want to rule. There are some rulers who have in the past wanted to rule Lebanon, but they were asked in 1976 by the Maronite president of Lebanon to come in and help. The Arab League signs off on this, and they come in. So, also relation to world events, Ukraine is considered the same by Russia. Russia considers Ukraine historically and geographically within its sphere of influence, and that it's a red line for you to try to expand your military alliance against us, who we are the big bad horrible person of the world, and you try to put that into our sphere of influence. That's a red line, and the Russians have indicated that they have actions to back up their beliefs. So the phrase is Lebanon is easy to swallow, but difficult to digest. So the Syrians did come in and they did play a role in, I don't want to use the term stabilizing, because they added one more complication to Lebanon. The Lebanese don't need any more complications. Life is already complicated enough for the Lebanese, but because the Arab League signed off on it, one has to at least imagine there was some um, uh, uh, relationship there to try to make life better for the Lebanese. I don't really think the Arab League would sign off on Syria taking over Lebanon. I think the hope was, okay, maybe they can add some force here to help stabilize the situation. 1978, we have Fatah fighters who participate in a coastal road massacre. The Israelis, I think 4 days later, very quickly, they have Operation Litani. That gets the UN involved. So what else is happening in this time, 1978, 1979? We have the hostage crisis in Iran. So we have the developing of Shia theocracy among the Persians. And people in Lebanon are looking and saying, well, that we could do that too, potentially. So we have sort of a perfect storm of terribleness that's happening in the south of Lebanon. So Fatah, one of the wings of the Palestinian resistance, of which there are many, they get the Israelis to invade. The United Nations creates a force, United Nations force in Lebanon, something like this. And they're there. Then there's a multinational force that comes in later as well. Now that gets us to 1982. And the Sabra and Shatila massacres occur. As I've shared in my previous live stream, I visited the Shatila refugee camp. There's so much blood, history, and sadness related to that. That's a separate conversation. But the IDF worked with some Christian militias in order to execute that massacre. That was not simply done by the IDF. The IDF allowed the SLA, the subcontractor that they used, right? A Maronite militia to come in and do that killing. Ariel Sharon was part of that infamous war criminal. I mean, Ariel Sharon, that's a different stream in and of itself. In 1983, the Marine Corps barracks is bombed in Beirut. There was a cartoon in a U.S. newspaper at the time from 1983, and the caption said, "Okay, Marines, we're faced with Druze and Shia Muslims being backed by the Syrians against the Christian phalangists. The Druze and Shias are divided among themselves, as are the Christians. The Israeli pullout is leaving a gap that the Lebanese army probably can't fill, and the PLO is coming back. Nobody likes us, and it's all preceded by 2,000 years of bloodshed. Any questions?" And again, I'm laughing not because I'm happy about the bloodshed, not because I'm happy about the disaster that this brought to Lebanon, but because you can start to see it just keeps getting more complicated and further away from the sort of project for the Lebanese. This idea of, what is our country? Do we have a country? Can we live together? And I think it's helpful to pause and reflect about Bosnia and what I saw there. So obviously lots of trouble in the 90s, which goes back centuries. Muslim, Christian, the invasions of the Ottomans, the government of the Turks, and all those scores were being settled in the 90s in the Yugoslav war. And yet I visited Bosnia, I visited Republika Srpska, I visited Serbia, and it's a very fragile piece, but it's held together since the 90s from people who don't like each other, and they've managed to live in a country together. The other option, obviously, is secession and creating your own country. I, for one, as a supporter of independence movements in which there is a viable state and an idea, some of you may know I was in Scotland on the day of the referendum. I was campaigning for yes. I wanted Scotland to be out of the UK because I think part of that is being born in Singapore and having come from a small nation state that governs itself. I don't believe in sort of big conglomerates. I believe in smaller local government and people being accountable to people they know and recognize and share values with. That's a lot easier to run things together. And big surprise, Singapore is a well run country. Switzerland is a well run country. The Netherlands is a well run country. It doesn't mean I agree with everything that happens in those countries, but they are efficient governments because they are expressions of the will and the culture and the thought process of the people. And so when you think about Lebanon and go back to our map, they could certainly, the Maronites, if the Maronites and the Sunnis wanted to leave and create their own state, they could certainly do that. The Shia could argue for that, and different minorities could live in different places. I'm not ruling out partition. I don't I don't think it's necessarily the best case scenario, but I don't think any of the groups necessarily would argue for that. In some senses, they all want all of it, and that's problematic. You've got to find a way to either live together or to separate. But the way that is going on cannot continue. All right, let's look at the chat. I hope you talk about the USS Liberty. Just wait, honey. It's coming. We cannot ignore the Liberty. We can't ignore a lot of stuff, okay? But all in good time. Every people should have national self-determination. I agree to that to an extent. I just think it has to be done with some kind of agreement. And obviously, some people are not going to let go. A people that I keep talking about all the time are the Kurds. The Kurds did not ask for Sykes-Picot. They did not ask for a couple Englishmen drinking brandy to draw straight lines on a map of the Middle East and not include a country for them. Okay. So, how do the Kurds have their own state? Should the Kurds have their own state? Are any of the countries involved with the Kurds going to give them their own state? Absolutely not. Iraq, Turkey, Syria, they're not interested in doing that. But do the Kurds deserve their own state? I mean, that's an open question. The idea that people deserve a state, I don't think. This is a Noam Chomsky quote. He says, "No state has the right to exist." Right to exist, and I agree with that idea in that the right to exist implies something irrevocable that, and we have throughout history, we've seen different forms of things. You've had a republic of such and such a place or a kingdom of such and such a place. Things change. And sometimes borders get larger, borders get smaller. But this idea, like, this is how it is and it's never going to change. And self-determination happens. Yes, but sometimes peoples die out or peoples move or countries get larger, countries get smaller. So I do think that it's important for people to have self-determination, but it should be done as much as possible within the laws. And if not, then you can still live as peoples within those places. So, for example, in southern France and in northern Spain, I visited the Basque countries on both sides of that border, and they have their own television station. They teach that language in their schools. The language is all over the signs. I heard it being spoken. It's a very difficult language, but they still, in a way, are preserving their national identity. One of my favorite languages to hear is Welsh. When you're in Wales, you can hear this. So you don't have to have a nation state in order to preserve your culture, your language, your history, your people. It's an easy way to do it. One could even argue it's a lazy way to do it because you don't have a choice, but it's almost a harder project to do it when you don't have your own state. But you can still preserve your culture and your people outside of a nation state structure. Did you say the Palestinians are Shia or Sunni? I said of the ones that are, I think the overwhelming majority are Sunni. Stephen, what do you think about the Republic by Plato, and can it be implemented? Okay, I did a review on the channel about the Republic, so feel free to take a look at that. I don't want to recapitulate that here. From Scotland, God bless Scotland. Okay, so let's continue on. I said Syria entered the chat, right? So in 1983, effectively, the US enters the chat. Now, the US had already entered the chat through Israel. remember who sells weapons to Israel, who backs Israel in the UN, who vetoes whatever they are told to veto by the Israelis, the US. So over time, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, whoever looked to the US as potentially, wow, these are people who quote unquote love freedom, they're going to come help us. And they connected the dots and they said, well, who sells the weapons? Who covers for these people in the UN? And the US kept showing who they were. And they are supporters, unconditional, I might add, unconditional support of Israel. This is a dogma of American political life. And James O'Keefe was on LBC radio, I want to say a couple weeks ago, and he kept asking the lady, he said, how many bodies, how many children does Israel need to kill before we would stop supporting? And he kept pushing her, and she said, oh, that's not the question, and it's not about this. He kept pushing, and he basically got her to admit there would be no number. There is no way that they would ever stop supporting Israel. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? Why is it that Israel gets unconditional support? There is a major problem with this dogma of American political life. I think maybe for the first time in my lifetime, this is actually being questioned in America. We saw it in the protests on the college campuses. We've seen it in the marches that have continued on. I'm not someone who participates in protests, but they have continued on. The numbers may be small, numbers aren't important. What matters is that it's continued on during this time period. So US has entered the chat, and that meant that Americans in this part of the world were targeted as well, and they were killed. The president of the American University of Beirut was shot in the head. That turns out to be Malcolm Kerr. The president there was actually Steve Kerr's father. If you know, he was the coach of the Golden State Warriors, and I think of the U.S. men's basketball team. His father was executed, murdered in Lebanon by terrorists. Okay, so that gets us to 1989, and you get a ceasefire. What has happened in the meantime is the Lebanese pound has collapsed. And as usual, the Lebanese are very resilient people. They're finding ways to live. And the way that I experienced it most recently during the summer was they use the US dollar for a lot of their financial transactions. And they use the Lebanese dinar for much smaller transactions. So let's say if I'm going to buy a coffee or buy some oranges, or if I'm in a market, I'm going to buy some za'atar or some tea or something, I'm just going to give that. But I should have investigated this further. I would have just brought a bunch of US dollars with me. I had to keep going to ATMs to withdraw money because the banks are seen as criminal entities in Lebanon. So people don't trust the banks. That means they don't process credit cards because they're worried the bank is going to steal this money. So everything is about cash. And so since the US dollar is perceived as a stable currency, you're going to use it for transactions. So that's how the Lebanese people have gotten around. They've just used other currencies as their own currency has collapsed. By the year 2000, the Israelis finally pull out. Keep in mind, they invaded in 1982. So it was an 18-year occupation of the south of Lebanon. And that means Hafez al-Assad dies, I think around the same time. And so with the Israelis withdrawing, then the pressure's like to the Syrians, hey, you came in here to help us with this. You can leave now. This political pressure. Syrians don't leave right away. By 2005, the Syrians finally leave. You have someone who has come into the political atmosphere this time representing the Gulf states. So if we think about the competing interests in Lebanon, we have Syria, we have Iran, we have Israel, we have the United States. We also have the Gulf states via Saudi Arabia. And we haven't even, remember, that's apart from the people inside Lebanon. It's their own country. I'm just talking about the people all around them that are using Lebanon as a political pawn. What does Lebanon represent to the Gulf states? In a sense, it's a vacation spot because in the Gulf countries, you just have air conditioning during the summer. All you can do is go to the malls where there's air conditioning and walk around, but you don't have to do that. I'm not saying that Lebanon is very cool during the summer because I was there during the summer and it's quite warm. I come from the tropics, so heat doesn't bother me as much. But what I mean to say is it's not death-killing heat, and there's water and there's an opportunity to walk around. And so the Saudis wanted to have some influence in Lebanon as well, and this was expressed in investment, etc. Rafiq Hariri, who the airport is named after in Beirut, is representative of this Saudi interest. The idea of trying to, I don't want to say fix Lebanon, because there's no fixing Lebanon, quote unquote. It's just trying to put an interest in. Hariri is killed, and the question is, who killed Hariri? Um, Hezbollah is going to say it was Israel. Others are going to say it was Hezbollah. And I haven't looked into the issue enough to tell you who killed Hariri. But if I haven't alluded to it already, we had the Armenian refugees come in 1920 and 21. We have the Palestinian refugees coming in 47, 48. And then we have a Syrian civil war in 2012, helped in part by, guess who? The United States. And we get the Lebanese get all of these refugees. And I was talking to some Lebanese about the Syrian refugees, and I said, "So what's going on with the Syrian refugees?" And they said, "Well, Stephen, before they used to live in a tent in Syria, and they got money from the UN, and now they live in an apartment in Lebanon, and they get money from the UN, or they live in a tent here and they get more money, whatever it might be." So either side of the border, the argument was either side of the border, they may still continue to get aid from the international community. But once again, Lebanon, a country with its own problems, a country without a lot of money, takes in refugees willingly or no. There are lots of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. 2019, you have demonstrations. 2022 elections, there is still no president from those elections. 2023 financial crisis, people who saved their whole life getting ready to retire. Stories were told to me of how all that money was wiped out of their bank accounts. The financial crisis wiped out a lot of people. They had to go back to work. They'd saved their whole lives. There is a question of possible oil reserves on the southern maritime border of Lebanon. But part of the problem of developing that, now keep in mind, this is a great boon. We know what oil can do for countries in terms of oil wealth. And certainly Lebanon could use that. But part of that is it's not a savior. You're not going to have oil money and now the problems in Lebanon are going to be solved. However, it's hard to really explore and develop oil reserves when your country is at war, effectively, even within itself and besieged by other peoples. So hopefully, and we're a little bit past an hour, so I didn't want to keep people too much longer. But hopefully that gives a beginner's. My goal was a beginner's guide to Lebanon from a beginner, and I hope that gives you some sense of all of the competing interests that you have in Lebanon, apart from the challenges that the Lebanese people have themselves. If the Lebanese were totally isolated and there wasn't Iran and there wasn't Syria and there wasn't Israel and there wasn't the United States and there wasn't the Saudis and there wasn't Europe and there wasn't Turkey, Lebanon would still have problems because they have to figure out how they're going to live with each other. And the National Pact from 1943 was an attempt to do this. I think it is at best failing, and the Lebanese have to decide, do we want to still continue to try to build a country together, or might it be better for us to separate and try to go our own ways? I think that is a fundamental and easy question for the Lebanese to ask themselves. Chat. People should be able to live without discrimination and feel part of a community. And I think people want a nation because they find this is a good solution for the problem. Yeah, Salim, that's an interesting point. The deal is you don't need to have a nation state in order to live without discrimination and feel part of a community. There are many places in the world in which minorities who don't have a nation state, they have their community and they don't necessarily need a nation. Young people aren't enslaved to Zaya propaganda. Thankfully, things will change a lot over the next 40 years. God wills. Zatar, king of spices. I agree. Didymus. In fact, I think that was the challenge is trying to taste all. I was at a market in Tripoli with my guide trying to pick through the zatars, and you just keep tasting different ones, and you're thinking, oh, I can't take all of these back. So which zatar am I going to talk about? Some other very kind words in the chat. Let's go another 5 more minutes, and if there's any more questions, I'd love to try to do my best to answer them. In the description of the video, there is a link to this map. There's a link to the book that I read. As I said, it was written in 1989, so there's still so much more information, but she's an excellent writer. And I actually ordered her sequel to that book, you could say. She wrote it in 2008. There's still a lot that's happened in Lebanon since 2008. So going to Lebanon during this time as I primarily wanted to go to Lebanon. So why did I go to Lebanon this summer? Because I wanted to make sure I want to make sure I understand comprehensively what is going on in the Middle East. I'm intrigued for a number of reasons. So I've been to Jordan and I've been to Cyprus. And so Lebanon, I was the next country for me to visit. Next summer, I'm hoping to go to Egypt, and over time, just to visit all those countries, talk to those people, understand a little bit more about what's going on. What are the larger problems, instead of, as we know, the lies, the lies, the lies, the lies that we just keep getting from the media. So when I visited, I just I wasn't prepared for the fact that things are so bad in Lebanon, and how normally the people just continue to live their lives, in a sense, because they don't have a choice. They're not a sort of people to sit around and cry and complain about things to you. As I said, they are hardworking people. They just want to work and make a life for themselves, and um, and build and lead their families like so many other parts of the world. They're not being allowed to do so because of forces that are larger than them. What I've described in Lebanon is they have both intrinsic problems and extrinsic problems. So, as I said, even if we were to remove all the countries that want a piece of Lebanon and want to influence what's going on in Lebanon, Lebanon itself has to figure out who they are. I didn't know that until I visited this summer. When I visited, I understood just how comprehensively difficult the problem is. And as I read the history of it, I understood it's even more complicated than that. So if you just look at the last 20 years of Lebanese history, and then you put it against all of the 5,000 years of history, I still had a very wonderful experience. Power went out a couple times when I was there. Um, Internet was questionable at times. These are all first world problems. I had a wonderful time. The food in Lebanon is outrageously good. Um, I think about the cuisine being developed over thousands of years, and some of the ingredients they don't live in other places. It'd be the lemons in Lebanon. They grow at a specific height in the mountains, and it just gives it a different flavor. I can't describe it to you, but the produce and the food in Lebanon, it's simple. It's presented in a way, it's similar to Balkan cuisine in that they're just taking ingredients and presenting them to you simply. They're not trying to get very very fancy about it. But the food's outrageously good. The people are very friendly and welcoming. There's a great natural beauty to the land. I took photos in which I showed people. I said, "Take a look at this," and they said, "Oh, where is this?" And I said, "It's Lebanon." And of course, in their mind, Lebanon's this war torn country that's destroyed everywhere. And there are parts of it that look like that. You could walk. I spent a day walking from Shatila to the American University. It was too hot. I should have been drinking more water. It was difficult. But it's about an hour and a half walk from Shatila to the American University, which is on the coast. And every sort of life is represented there in the capital. And uh, the potential for what Lebanon could be if it was allowed to be itself is unbelievable. I don't think anything could hold the Lebanese back. And if you see the Lebanese diaspora, how have the Lebanese conducted themselves in other parts of the world? They are elite in many other places, and a lot of the money that supports Lebanon comes from abroad. I think something like 30%, maybe more, maybe less, comes in from Lebanese families living abroad, supporting their families here in Lebanon. So the Lebanese, if they're given the opportunity, they're going to work, they're going to become elite, and they're going to survive. I think the question has to be, what is Lebanon going to do for itself? And right now, they're struggling to elect a president. They're struggling to move forward. Some of these problems are endemic, and maybe the solution will never present itself. It's very easy to say there's a solution. It's a very Western-oriented way of thinking that there is a solution to every problem. That is certainly an American way of thinking, and I can't help the fact that I'm an American that occurs to me first. Yes, there is a solution, but there is not a solution to every problem in the natural order. Sometimes we make things complicated for ourselves enough that there's not a solution. Um, have you been to Palestine? Yes. I was in Hebron. I've been to Bethlehem, Nazareth. I went down to the Erez crossing down by Gaza. So I've had a chance to go to parts of Palestine and meet Palestinians and talk to them. Um, I'll share on my X and Blue Sky. My theory is that Western and non-Western countries are terrified to stand against warring countries because deadly weapons are far too much of a threat. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Any parsley salad? Yes, that was one of the things that was in my mind. Didymus is that parsley salad with this lemon and Armenian salad, which has lots of different expressions, but tomato, cucumber, olive oil. It's just I'm getting hungry talking about it, and it's an Ember Day. It's a fasting day for me, so I have to be careful. Um, in a map of the Levant, what is Rojava? I don't know. I don't know, Jamie. Sorry about that. Lebanon is the queen of the Middle East, and their dialect is beautiful, like that of Syria. Tabule. Yes. Thank you, Ida. And Ida, I hope that you're not going to scold me for what I presented. I hope that I did justice to your country, and happy to be corrected. If not in the live stream, in the comment section afterwards. Thank you all for coming. And if you'd like to know more, I also put a link in the description to Palestine Bookshelf, which is a new project that I'm launching on October the 7th, which obviously is going to be about books about Palestine. But that has been what has taken over my personal channel for the last year. And I'm still going to be continuing to cover related ideas on my channel. But over the next 3 or 4 months, I'm going to transition everything over to Palestine Bookshelf, where that will serve as a holding place to collect all of the ideas and all the books that we're talking about. And then starting in 2025, this regular channel, Stephen Heiner, will go back to discussing other books because there are other things to cover besides the Palestinian issue. But I want to give the Palestine issue its own channel to work on. So please consider going over, subscribing, and sharing it with people so that we can get some momentum going into our launch. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the kind words. Knowing that the Israelis, they will claim tabbouleh like they did with hummus. Yeah, those of you who know, the Israelis will do videos in which they say like, "Oh, look, hummus, Israeli." All of these like classic dishes of the Levant, which have been around for so many years, and Israel, which is barely older than my mother, is trying to claim that these are their dishes. Yeah. Again, some other kind words. Thank you, everybody, and please look in the description. Consider supporting, sharing this channel, and sharing Palestine Bookshelf with your friends. And appreciate you coming on.